Can one woman's greatest shame become her greatest strength? In the harsh frontier town of Cedar Falls, where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children, Margaret Sullivan carried a secret that made her worthless in the eyes of society. But when fate threw her into the path of widower Thomas Mitchell and his 3 motherless children, she would discover that sometimes what the world calls a curse might just be a blessing in disguise. Before we begin this tale of redemption and unexpected love, tell me where you're listening from, and do you believe that true love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances? Prepare yourself for a story that will remind you that sometimes our greatest weaknesses become our most profound gifts. Boston, Massachusetts, autumn of 1881. The morning mist hung low over the cobblestone streets as Margaret Sullivan sat in Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house, staring at the document that would seal her fate. The paper bore the seal of the Boston Municipal Court, an order of indentured service to settle her debts. At 26, educated and skilled in household management, Margaret was considered worthless by society for one devastating reason: she was barren. The diagnosis had come 3 years earlier from Dr. Hamilton Prescott, delivered with clinical detachment. No man of standing would consider a wife who cannot provide him with heirs. Those words had condemned her to a life of decreasing options. Without the possibility of marriage, she had no family support. Without family, she had no protection from poverty. And without money, she had no escape from the spiral that led her to this moment. Mrs. Whitmore, the boarding house proprietress, had been kind initially, but as Margaret's savings dwindled, patience wore thin. "I'm sorry, dear, but charity doesn't pay my rent. You owe me $47, and the law is quite clear about what happens to debtors." Now Margaret faced the courthouse steps, where she would stand before potential buyers, her worth determined by her ability to work. The irony wasn't lost on her: educated, capable, yet considered worthless because she couldn't bear children. Officer Patrick O'Malley, a kindly Irishman, came to escort her. "It's time, miss." Margaret wore her best grey wool dress, carefully pressed despite its worn appearance. Walking to the courthouse felt like a march to the gallows, but she kept her head high, determined to maintain what dignity she could. The courthouse steps were crowded with men who attended these auctions: farmers seeking cheap labor, factory owners wanting workers who couldn't quit, businessmen preferring servants with no legal standing. Judge Blackwood, a small man compensating with an oversized voice, stood on a wooden platform. "Gentlemen, we have several individuals whose circumstances require them to enter contracts of service." When Margaret's name was called, she climbed the platform with as much grace as possible. Judge Blackwood read her particulars like inventory. Margaret Sullivan, 26 years of age, literate, experienced in household management. Debt, $53 including court costs. The bidding began immediately. A tobacco farmer offered 18 months of service. A mill owner countered with 15 months. Margaret listened to them negotiate the length of her bondage with detached horror. Then a voice from the back called out, "6 months plus transportation to Colorado Territory." The crowd turned to see a tall man in a worn but well-maintained brown coat, perhaps in his 30s, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. His hair was dark with touches of gray, and his blue eyes held a practical expression. "6 months, sir?" Judge Blackwood frowned. "That hardly covers the debt." The man pulled out a worn leather pouch. $53 cash, plus transportation and fair wages for any work beyond the contract term." A murmur ran through the crowd. It was unheard of to pay cash rather than service time. Judge Blackwood looked displeased, but couldn't argue with cash in hand. "Sold to Mr. Thomas Mitchell of Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory." Within an hour, Margaret found herself on a train bound for Denver, with Thomas Mitchell sitting across the aisle. He had said perhaps a dozen words, all strictly practical. As the train pulled away from Boston, Margaret watched the familiar skyline disappear, heading toward an uncertain future with a man who expected his investment to pay off. The train car was stuffy, filled with coal smoke and unwashed bodies. Margaret sat stiffly, acutely aware of the man who had bought her. Thomas Mitchell seemed content to ignore her existence, focusing on a ledger while making notations in columns of figures. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable. The brown coat showed careful mending, his boots were well made but scuffed, and his hands bore permanent stains of a man who worked with them daily. Nothing suggested cruelty, but Margaret had learned appearances could deceive. As they traveled westward, Margaret tried to piece together information about Colorado Territory. It was still wild country. Newspapers occasionally carried stories about Indian troubles, mining claims, and rough men seeking fortunes in gold and silver. No place for a woman alone, which perhaps explained why Thomas Mitchell paid cash for her contract. The realization hit her like a blow. He hadn't bought her services as a housekeeper. He had bought a woman. In a territory where women were scarce, her inability to bear children might be seen as an advantage. No pregnancy complications, no additional mouths to feed. Miss Sullivan, Thomas's voice broke through her thoughts. I imagine you have questions about your situation and have probably jumped to conclusions that may not be accurate. Margaret met his gaze, trying to read his expression. I'm afraid I don't understand, sir. You're wondering why a man would pay cash for an indentured servant when the point is to get labor without paying wages. You're wondering what I expect that's worth $53 plus train fare. Heat rose in Margaret's cheeks, but she didn't deny it. Thomas was quiet, choosing his words carefully. I have a ranch outside Cedar Falls. It's profitable enough to support my family. I raise cattle mostly, some horses. The work is hard and the hours are long. He paused, glancing out the window. I also have 3 children. My wife died 2 years ago in childbirth, and since then, managing a ranch and raising children isn't something one man can do effectively. Margaret felt some tension ease. Children. He needed help with children. I've tried hiring local women, but Cedar Falls isn't Boston. The few unmarried women are already spoken for. The married women have their own households, and hiring someone from Denver means wages I can't afford. Oh, so you came to Boston to buy a servant, Margaret said with some bitterness. I came to find someone who needed a fresh start as much as I needed help. Miss Sullivan, I'm not going to pretend your situation gives you much choice. You're legally bound to work for me for 6 months, and I expect you to honor that contract. But I'm not the kind of man who takes advantage of a woman's misfortune. Margaret studied his face for deception. And after 6 months? If you choose to stay, you'll receive wages and room and board. If you choose to leave, I'll provide transportation wherever you want to go and enough money to get settled. It was more than she had dared hope. Why? Why those terms instead of the usual arrangement? Thomas was quiet so long, Margaret thought he might not answer. Because I know what it's like to have circumstances beyond your control decide your fate. Because I have a daughter, and I hope if she ever finds herself in a similar situation, someone will treat her with respect. The simple honesty did more to ease Margaret's fears than elaborate promises could have. This was a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have the ground shift beneath your feet. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've met my children. They transferred to a smaller train in Denver for the final leg. The train to Cedar Falls was little more than passenger cars attached to a freight engine, and the tracks were so rough Margaret felt her teeth rattling. Thomas seemed unaffected, probably used to it. There, he said, pointing out the window. Cedar Falls. Margaret's heart sank. Cedar Falls was tiny. A main street with perhaps a dozen buildings, a few side streets with scattered houses, and beyond that, nothing but rolling hills covered in prairie grass and occasional cottonwood trees. The train station was a platform with a small building, serving as both ticket office and freight depot. As they stepped off, Margaret was struck by the vastness of the sky and the sense of complete exposure. In Boston, buildings provided shelter and boundaries. Here, the horizon stretched endlessly. Mr. Mitchell! A boy of perhaps 12 ran toward them, clearly Thomas's son. Same dark hair, blue eyes, square jaw. Behind him came two more children, a girl about 10 and a boy no more than 6. "Pa!" the youngest called, launching himself into Thomas's arms. "You're back! Did you bring her? Is that her?" "Mind your manners, Timothy," Thomas said warmly. "Yes, this is Miss Sullivan. Miss Sullivan. These are my children, Samuel, Rebecca, and Timothy." Margaret looked at 3 faces staring with curiosity and wariness. Samuel was already showing signs of the man he'd become, with broad shoulders and capable hands. Rebecca had her father's blue eyes, but lighter hair, and something in her expression suggested she'd grown up faster than most 10-year-old girls. Timothy was all energy and excitement. "Children, I'm pleased to meet you. Are you really from Boston?" Rebecca asked carefully. "Pa said you were from the city." "I am, indeed. Have you ever been to a big city?" "No, ma'am," Samuel answered. "We've been to Denver a few times, but Pa says Boston is much bigger. Much bigger. So big you could walk for hours and never reach the edge." Timothy's eyes went wide. "Hours? How do people find their way home?" Before Margaret could answer, Thomas stepped in. "We can continue this at home. Miss Sullivan has had a long journey." Home was a ranch house about 3 miles outside town, reached by a dirt road. The house was larger than expected, built of logs and stone with a wide front porch and several outbuildings. As they approached, Margaret could see cattle grazing and horses in a fenced pasture. "The house has 4 bedrooms, Thomas explained. "The children each have their own room, and there's a guest room that will be yours. My room is downstairs." The interior was clean, but clearly lacking a woman's touch. Everything was neat and orderly, but there was no warmth, no sense of home, just people going through the motions of living. "Samuel and I do most of the cooking," Thomas said. "Rebecca helps when she can, but she's also responsible for keeping the house clean and looking after Timothy when we're working outside." Margaret nodded, understanding the enormous burden that had fallen on this family. Rebecca was essentially running a household at 10. Samuel was working like a grown man at 12, and Timothy was being raised by his siblings as much as by his father. "Your room is up here," Thomas said, leading her upstairs to a simply furnished bedroom with a window looking out over the ranch. "It's perfect," Margaret said, and meant it. "I'll let you get settled. Dinner is usually around 6. Nothing fancy. We eat to fuel the work." After he left, Margaret unpacked her few belongings. Through the window she could see Samuel chopping wood, Rebecca hanging laundry, and Timothy playing with a wooden toy horse. They were a family doing their best to hold together after tragedy. She changed into something more practical and went downstairs to help with dinner. She found Thomas staring at the pantry with the expression of a man facing an impossible task. "May I?" Margaret asked, gesturing toward the stove. Thomas stepped aside with obvious relief. Within an hour, she had created a meal far more appealing than anything this kitchen had produced recently. Cornbread from scratch, fried chicken, and green beans with bacon and onions. When she called the family to dinner, the children's faces showed amazement. "It smells like Ma's cooking used to," Timothy said in wonder. Rebecca shot him a look that suggested this wasn't discussed, but Thomas just nodded. "Your mother was an excellent cook." "The children haven't had a proper meal in quite some time." As they ate, Margaret listened to the conversation. Samuel eagerly told his father about work accomplished, Rebecca quietly managed Timothy's table manners, and Thomas asked each child about their activities. Despite their losses, this was a family that cared deeply for each other. After dinner, Margaret helped Rebecca clear the table while the boys did evening chores. Rebecca cast sidelong glances at Margaret, clearly wanting to say something. "What is it, Rebecca? Are you going to stay?" the girl asked in a rush. "I mean, after your contract, are you going to stay and help us?" Margaret was touched by the hope in the child's voice, but knew better than to make promises she might not keep. "I don't know yet, dear. 6 months is a long time. We'll have to see how we all get along." Rebecca nodded, but Margaret could see disappointment. This little girl had already lost her mother and was afraid of losing anyone else who might bring stability. That night, lying in her narrow bed, listening to unfamiliar ranch sounds, Margaret realized her situation was more complex than expected. These children didn't need just a housekeeper. They needed a mother figure. Thomas didn't need just domestic help. He needed a partner in raising his family. And Margaret, despite her fears, found herself wanting to be the person they needed. Not because she was legally bound, but because for the first time in years, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. Margaret woke before dawn to roosters crowing and distant cattle lowing. The mountain air was crisp, and through her window, she could see the sky lightening over eastern hills. She dressed quickly and went downstairs, hoping to start breakfast before the family woke. To her surprise, Thomas was already in the kitchen, stoking the stove fire. "You're up early," he observed. "I'm not used to sleeping past sunrise," Margaret replied. "The ranch doesn't allow for sleeping in. The animals need tending regardless of how tired we might be." Margaret moved toward the pantry. "What time do the children usually wake?" "Samuel gets up when I do. We start outside chores together. Rebecca and Timothy usually wake when they smell breakfast cooking." He paused, watching her pull ingredients from shelves. "You don't have to cook every meal. The children and I managed well enough before. Cooking is something I enjoy, and please call me Margaret. If we're sharing a household, formal address seems unnecessary." "Margaret then, and you should call me Thomas." As she prepared breakfast, Margaret found herself falling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. The kitchen was well equipped, if sparse, and she began mentally cataloging improvements that could be made. Samuel appeared as she pulled biscuits from the oven, followed by Rebecca gently coaxing Timothy into getting dressed. "Good morning," Margaret said to each in turn. Timothy was full of questions. "Did you really live in a house with gas lights? Do they have horses in the city? Have you ever seen the ocean?" "Timothy," Rebecca admonished, "let Miss Margaret eat. It's quite all right." "Yes, Timothy, I lived with gas lights, though they make everything smell faintly of sulfur. There are horses in the city, but mostly pulling carriages through crowded streets. And yes, I've seen the ocean many times." "What does it look like?" Margaret thought carefully. "Imagine standing in your yard looking toward those mountains. Now imagine that instead of mountains, there was water as far as you could see in every direction. Water that moves and changes color with weather, sometimes blue-green, sometimes gray, sometimes almost black during storms." "Is it bigger than the creek?" Timothy asked, making Samuel snort with amusement. "Much bigger. So big that ships can sail for days without seeing land." Thomas stood and reached for his hat. "That's enough about the ocean. Samuel and I have cattle to check, and you and Rebecca have chores." After the males departed, Margaret found herself alone with Rebecca for the first time. "You've been managing the house by yourself, haven't you?" Margaret observed as they washed dishes. "Mostly. Empire and Samuel help when they can, but ranch work takes most of their time, and Timothy tries to help, but he's still little." Margaret heard resignation in the girl's voice and felt sympathy. At 10, Rebecca had been forced to take on responsibilities that would challenge many grown women. "What was your mother like?" Margaret asked gently. Rebecca's hands stilled in the dishwater. She made everything seem easier. Even when things went wrong, she never seemed worried. She said problems were just puzzles waiting to be solved. That sounds like a wise woman. She was. She used to sing while she worked. The house seems too quiet sometimes without her singing. Margaret made a mental note to bring music back to this house. Over the following hours, Margaret began understanding what running this household entailed. The house was larger than it first appeared, with rooms closed off since Mrs. Mitchell's death. The parlor was covered in dust sheets and smelled musty. "Pa closed it after Ma died," Rebecca explained. "He said it was too hard to keep clean if we weren't using it." But Margaret could see this had been Mrs. Mitchell's special space. A piano sat in one corner, sheet music still open, bookshelves lined one wall, and delicate china figurines sat on the mantelpiece. Does anyone play piano? Ma did. She tried to teach me, but after she died, Rebecca trailed off. Margaret lifted the piano cover and ran her fingers over keys. The instrument was somewhat out of tune, but functional. Would you like to continue lessons? Rebecca's face lit up before becoming cautious. Do you know how to play? I do. Not expertly, but well enough to teach basics. It was small, but Margaret could see how much the offer meant to the girl. When Thomas and Samuel returned for midday meal, they found the parlor uncovered and kitchen filled with stew aroma. Margaret had also baked bread and convinced Timothy to help tend a neglected herb garden. You've been busy, Thomas observed. I hope you don't mind. Rebecca mentioned this room had been closed since your wife's death, and it seemed shame to let such a lovely space go unused. Thomas was quiet, and Margaret wondered if she'd overstepped. But then he nodded slowly. Catherine always said this house was meant to be lived in, not preserved like a museum. She would have hated knowing we'd shut up her favorite room. During lunch, Margaret learned more about ranch life rhythms. The cattle required constant attention, checking for injuries, moving between pastures, maintaining fences, preparing for winter. Horses needed training and care, and there were always repairs to buildings and equipment. It's a lot for two people to manage, she observed. We make do, Samuel said, but Margaret could see exhaustion in his young face. I've been thinking that perhaps Timothy and I could take on tasks that don't require as much physical strength. Feeding chickens, collecting eggs, tending the garden, small things that would free up time for you and Samuel to focus on heavier work. Thomas looked surprised. That's not necessary, Margaret. You have enough managing the house. Actually, I think it would be good for Timothy to have more responsibility. And I grew up on my grandfather's farm outside Boston. I know my way around chickens and vegetable gardens. This was a slight exaggeration, but Margaret was confident she could learn what she needed. Samuel perked up. If you could handle the chickens, that would help a lot. They're more work than people think, and Timothy's still scared of the rooster. I am not, Timothy protested, cheeks reddening. Old Napoleon can be intimidating, Rebecca said diplomatically. He chased me up onto the fence post last week. Napoleon? Margaret asked. The rooster, Thomas explained with a slight smile. Timothy named him after seeing a picture in one of his mother's books. Seemed appropriate for such a dictatorial bird. As days passed, Margaret settled into ranch life rhythms. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spent mornings working with Rebecca on household tasks, afternoons helping in the garden or taking on small chores around the property, and evenings teaching Rebecca piano or helping Timothy with reading lessons Thomas had been struggling to maintain. The work was harder than anything in Boston, but there was satisfaction that surprised her. Every task had clear purpose. Every effort contributed directly to the family's well-being. There was no time for idle contemplation that had filled her boarding house days. No energy left for dwelling on past disappointments or future uncertainties. She also began understanding the complex dynamics of this family forced to reorganize around absence. Samuel had stepped into eldest son role with admirable but heartbreaking seriousness. Rebecca had become little mother to Timothy while maintaining the household. Timothy seemed to carry the weight of being the baby who still needed protection, even as everyone else struggled to stay afloat. Thomas was clearly doing his best to be both father and mother, but Margaret could see the strain. He was patient with their questions and concerns, attentive to their needs, clearly devoted to their welfare. But there was loneliness about him, a sense of a man carrying burdens too heavy for one person alone. 3 weeks into her stay, Margaret thought she was beginning to understand her place in the family's routine. She had successfully taken over most cooking and household management, freeing Rebecca to focus on education and childhood pursuits. Timothy had become her eager assistant in the garden and with chickens. Even Samuel had begun opening up, sharing concerns about the ranch and asking her opinion on matters Thomas might not have time to address. But on a crisp October morning, Everything changed. Margaret was in the chicken coop teaching Timothy the proper way to approach a broody hen when they heard horses approaching at speed. Through the open door, she could see a dust cloud on the road. "Pa!" Timothy called, dropping his egg basket. "Riders coming!" Thomas emerged from the barn, Samuel close behind, both moving with quick alertness of men who knew unexpected visitors could mean trouble. Margaret gathered scattered eggs while keeping an eye on approaching riders. There were 3 of them, better dressed than most ranchers and cowboys she'd observed in town. Their horses were sleek and well-fed, their clothes clean and pressed, and there was something about their bearing that suggested official business. The lead rider dismounted near the front porch and removed his hat, revealing a man in his 50s with graying hair and the soft appearance of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the saddle. "Mr. Thomas Mitchell?" he called out. "That's me," Thomas replied, moving toward the house but keeping distance. "What can I do for you, gentlemen? My name is Harold Westbrook, representing the Territorial Authority for Child Welfare. These are my associates, Mr. James Crawford and Mr. William Hayes." He gestured to his companions, both of whom remained mounted. "We're here to conduct an investigation regarding the welfare of minor children residing on this property." Margaret felt her blood run cold. Child welfare investigations were serious business and rarely ended well for struggling families. "Investigation?" Thomas's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could see tension in his shoulders. "What kind of investigation?" "We've received reports suggesting that the children living here may not be receiving proper care and supervision," Westbrook replied, pulling a folded document from his coat. "We have authority to examine living conditions, interview the children, and determine whether alternative arrangements might be necessary." "What kind of reports?" Samuel stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. "Who's been saying things about us?" "Samuel," Thomas said quietly, putting a restraining hand on his son's shoulder. "Let me handle this." Margaret could see Thomas struggling to maintain composure. The suggestion that his children weren't being properly cared for was clearly devastating to a man working himself to exhaustion, trying to be both father and mother. "May I see your credentials?" Margaret asked, stepping forward from the chicken coop. Westbrook looked surprised to be addressed by a woman, particularly one clearly not dressed as lady of the house. "And you are?" "Margaret Sullivan. I'm employed here as governess and household manager. If you're examining the welfare of these children, I think it's reasonable to verify that you have proper authority." Westbrook's expression shifted to disapproval. "Miss Sullivan, is it? Not Mrs." "That's correct." "I see." He exchanged a meaningful look with his companions. "And how long have you been employed in this household?" Margaret felt a chill of premonition. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Westbrook repeated, making a note in a small book. "And you're an unmarried woman, living in a house with a widowed man and his children?" "I fail to see how that's relevant to your investigation," Margaret replied, though she was beginning to understand exactly how it was relevant. "Oh, it's quite relevant, Miss Sullivan. One of the concerns brought to our attention is the appropriateness of having an unmarried woman in such close proximity to impressionable children, particularly when that woman's background and moral character are questionable." "Questionable," Thomas stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "Mr. Westbrook, I'll ask you to explain that statement." "Certainly." Westbrook consulted his notes. "Miss Sullivan was purchased at a public auction in Boston, Massachusetts, as an indentured servant. Her debts were paid by you, Mr. Mitchell, in exchange for a term of service. Such arrangements are often irregular and raise questions about the suitability of such a person to influence children." Margaret felt as though she'd been slapped. Someone had investigated her background and was using her circumstances against this family. "Miss Sullivan's past is irrelevant," Thomas said firmly. "She's provided excellent care for my children and has been nothing but proper in her conduct. That may be your opinion, Mr. Mitchell, but the territory has a responsibility to ensure that children are not exposed to influences that might corrupt their moral development." Westbrook looked directly at Margaret. A woman who sells herself into servitude to pay her debts raises questions about her character and judgment. She didn't sell herself, Rebecca said suddenly, her young voice shaking with emotion. She was sold because she didn't have any money, and that's not her fault. Rebecca, go in the house, Thomas ordered. But Pa, now. Rebecca reluctantly obeyed, but Margaret could see the girl was on the verge of tears. Timothy had moved to stand behind Samuel, clearly frightened by the tension. The next several hours were among the most difficult Margaret had ever experienced. Westbrook and his associates went through the house with tax assessor thoroughness, examining everything from pantry contents to children's clothing condition. They questioned each child separately, asking probing questions about daily routines, relationships with their father and Margaret, and whether they had ever witnessed anything inappropriate. Margaret was subjected to her own interrogation, during which Westbrook made it clear he considered her presence in the household inherently problematic. He questioned her about her past, her debt situation, the nature of her relationship with Thomas, and her long-term intentions. "Miss Sullivan," he said at one point, "surely you can understand how it appears to have an unmarried woman of your circumstances, living in such intimate proximity with a widowed man and his children. The potential for scandal, for improper relationships, for moral corruption of the children is significant. There has been nothing improper about my relationship with Mr. Mitchell or his children," Margaret replied firmly. "I am employed as governess and housekeeper, and that is exactly how I've conducted myself." "For now, perhaps," Westbrook said with a knowing smile. "But such arrangements have a way of evolving, don't they? A desperate woman, a lonely man, children who need a mother figure. It's a situation ripe for complications." When the investigation finally concluded, Westbrook gathered the family together on the front porch for his verdict. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, "while we found no evidence of immediate danger to the children, we do have serious concerns about current arrangements in this household." Thomas stood with arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled anger. The children clustered close to him, clearly frightened by the afternoon's events. "Our primary concern," Westbrook continued, "is the presence of Miss Sullivan in the household. Her background, her unmarried status, and the irregular nature of her employment create an environment that is not conducive to proper moral development of children." "What are you saying?" Thomas asked. "I'm saying that if Miss Sullivan remains in this household, we will be forced to recommend that the children be removed and placed in more appropriate guardianship." The words hit like a physical blow. Timothy began to cry. Rebecca grabbed Margaret's hand, and Samuel stepped protectively in front of his younger siblings. "However," Westbrook continued, "if Miss Sullivan were to leave voluntarily, we would consider the situation resolved and would have no further concerns about the children's welfare." Margaret felt the world spinning. In trying to help this family, she had instead brought them to the brink of destruction. Her presence, her past, her very existence was now threatening to tear apart the children she had come to love. "How long do we have to decide?" Thomas asked, his voice barely controlled. "We'll return in 1 week for your answer," Westbrook replied. "I trust you'll make the right choice for the children's sake." After the investigators left, the family sat in stunned silence in the parlor. Timothy was still crying quietly. Rebecca was pale and shaking, and Samuel looked as if he wanted to fight someone, but didn't know who. "This is my fault," Margaret said finally. "I should never have come here. I should never have put you in this position." "Don't," Thomas said sharply. "Don't you dare blame yourself for this." "But if you leave, those children lose the closest thing to a mother they've had in 2 years," Thomas interrupted. "They lose the stability they've just started to rebuild. They lose the happiness that's finally returned to this house. And for what? Because some bureaucrat thinks your past disqualifies you from caring about children. But if I stay, they could take the children away," Margaret pointed out. "Thomas, you heard what he said. They have authority to remove Samuel, Rebecca, and Timothy from your care. There has to be another way," Rebecca said suddenly. All eyes turned to the 10-year-old girl, who was looking at Margaret and her father with determined thoughtfulness. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Thomas asked. "Mr. Westbrook said the problem was that Margaret is unmarried," Rebecca said carefully. "So what if she wasn't unmarried anymore?" The suggestion hung in the air, like a thunderclap. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, while Thomas looked as if his daughter had suggested they all sprout wings and fly. "Rebecca," he said gently, it's not that simple." "Why not?" the girl persisted. "You like Margaret, don't you? And she likes us. And if you were married, then Mr. Westbrook couldn't say anything about it being inappropriate." The solution was so obvious, so logical, and so completely impossible. "Marriage isn't something you do just to solve a problem," Margaret said carefully. "People should marry because they love each other, because they want to build a life together, not because the government tells them they have to." "But you do want to build a life with us, don't you?" Timothy asked, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "You're not going to leave us like Ma did?" The innocent question broke Margaret's heart. These children had already lost one mother, and now they were facing the possibility of losing not only her, but each other as well. "Timothy," she said gently, "your mother didn't choose to leave you. She died, and that's very different from choosing to go away. But you're choosing," he pointed out with relentless 6-year-old logic. "You could choose to stay if you married Pa." Margaret looked at Thomas, expecting him to explain why their suggestion was impossible. Instead, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's not that simple," she said again, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually," Thomas said slowly, "maybe it is." Margaret stared at him in shock. "Thomas, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious." He stood up and began pacing the small parlor. "Think about it, Margaret. We work well together. The children clearly care about you, and you care about them. We respect each other, we enjoy each other's company, and we want the same thing, for this family to stay together." "But marriage," Margaret began. "Marriage doesn't have to be about romantic love," Thomas said, though something in his expression suggested the topic was more complex than he was making it sound. "It can be about partnership, about commitment, about building something together that's bigger than what either of us could create alone." Margaret felt overwhelmed. 3 hours ago, her biggest concern was whether the chickens were getting enough grain. Now she was being asked to consider marriage to a man she had known for less than a month. "I need time to think," she said finally. "We don't have much time," Thomas reminded her. "Westbrook is coming back in a week." "I know, I need to think about what it would mean, what it would change, whether it's the right thing to do." That night, Margaret lay staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the impossible choice she faced. Leave and break the hearts of 3 children who had already lost their mother, or stay and marry a man she barely knew in an arrangement that was practical rather than romantic. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years being told her inability to bear children made her worthless as a potential wife. Now she was being offered marriage specifically because children were already part of the equation. Children who needed a mother more than they needed a woman who could give them siblings. But was that enough? Could a marriage based on mutual respect and shared responsibility really work? And what about Thomas? Was he offering marriage because he cared for her as a woman, or simply because she represented a solution to his problems? As she finally drifted off to sleep, Margaret realized that the answer to those questions might determine not just her own future, but the future of an entire family that had already suffered enough loss for one lifetime. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Margaret made her way to the chicken coop, her mind still wrestling with the impossible decision. She had slept fitfully, wondering whether she was brave enough to accept what Thomas had suggested, or foolish enough to believe it could work. She found him already there, scattering grain with mechanical precision. His movements were stiff, formal, and she realized he was as uncomfortable with the previous evening's conversation as she was. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Morning." He didn't look at her, continuing to focus on his task. "Sleep well?" "Not particularly. I imagine you didn't either. They worked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the contented clucking of hens and distant cattle lowing. Finally, Thomas straightened and turned to face her. "Margaret, about what I said yesterday." "You don't need to take it back," she interrupted. "I understand you were trying to find a solution to an impossible situation." "I wasn't trying to take it back," he said firmly. "I was going to say that I meant every word of it." Margaret nearly dropped the egg she was holding. "Oh, I know it's not the kind of proposal most women dream of receiving," Thomas continued, his voice growing more confident. "I can't offer you romantic love or grand gestures, or the kind of courtship you probably experienced in Boston." "I never experienced courtship in Boston," Margaret said quietly. "Remember, I'm the woman no one wanted to marry." "Then they were fools," Thomas said with such conviction that Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Margaret, I may not be able to offer you everything a woman might want in a marriage, but I can offer you respect, partnership, and a family that already loves you." "And what do you get out of it?" she asked, "besides solving the problem with the welfare investigators?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking toward the mountains beyond the ranch. "I get a partner," he said finally. "Someone to share the load, someone who understands what it means to work towards something bigger than yourself. I get someone who makes my children laugh, who brings music back into our house, who makes us feel like a family again instead of just people living in the same place." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. "Thomas, I'm not going to pretend that I'm offering you a love match," he interrupted. "Catherine and I, what we had was special. And I'm not going to dishonor her memory by claiming I could feel the same way about someone else." The words stung, even though Margaret knew they were honest. "But," Thomas continued, "I am offering you something real. A home, a family, a place where you belong, and maybe, in time," he trailed off. "Maybe what? Maybe we could build something together that would be worth having, even if it's different from what either of us originally imagined." Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of deception or desperation. What she saw instead was a man being completely honest about his limitations and his hopes. "What about the children? Have you talked to them about this?" "They're the ones who suggested it," Thomas pointed out with a slight smile. "I think they'd be thrilled. But they're children. They don't understand what marriage really means, what kinds of complications it can create, don't they?" Thomas stepped closer. "They understand that they want you to stay. They understand that they feel safe and happy when you're here. Sometimes children see things more clearly than adults do." Margaret set down the egg basket and wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling cold despite the morning sun. "I need you to understand something," she said carefully. "The reason I was unmarriageable in Boston, the reason I ended up in debt and desperate enough to accept indentured servitude. I can't have children, Thomas. I'm barren." "I know." Margaret blinked in surprise. "You know? The paperwork from your sale mentioned it," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "It was listed as one of your characteristics. And that doesn't matter to you?" Thomas looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would it matter?" "I already have 3 children, Margaret. I don't need more children. I need help raising the ones I have." The simple acceptance in his voice brought tears to Margaret's eyes. For years, her inability to bear children had been treated as her greatest failing. To have someone dismiss it as irrelevant was almost overwhelming. "There are other things you should know," she continued. I have no experience with the physical aspects of marriage, and I can't promise that I'll ever feel the way a wife should feel about her husband." "Margaret," Thomas said gently, "I'm not asking you to pretend to feelings you don't have. I'm asking you to consider building something real with me, starting from where we are now, rather than where romantic novels say we should be. And if I can't, if I'm simply not capable of being the kind of wife you deserve, then we'll figure it out as we go," Thomas replied. "Just like we've been figuring out everything else." Margaret was quiet for a long time, considering not just his words, but the man speaking them. Thomas Mitchell was not the husband she had imagined in girlish dreams. He was practical rather than romantic, direct rather than poetic, weathered by loss and hard work rather than softened by easy living. But he was also honest, kind, and completely devoted to his children. He had treated her with respect from the moment he met her, had seen her as a person rather than just a servant, and was now offering her something she had never expected, a real place in the world. "If I said yes," she said slowly, "what would you expect from the marriage?" "Partnership," Thomas replied immediately. "Someone to share decisions with, someone I can trust to help me raise my children, someone who will be committed to making our family work." "And the other aspects of marriage?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I would hope that in time we might develop the kind of intimacy that makes a marriage more than just a business arrangement. But I wouldn't pressure you, and I wouldn't demand anything you weren't ready to give." It was more consideration than many husbands showed their wives, Margaret knew. Thomas was offering her a partnership rather than ownership. "I have conditions," she said suddenly. "Name them. If we do this, it has to be a real marriage, not just for the investigators, but in the eyes of the community and the law. I won't be your housekeeper who happens to share your name." "Agreed. And the children need to understand that this isn't just about keeping the family together now. If we marry, I'm committing to being their mother for the rest of their lives, through all the challenges that will bring." "They understand that better than you think," Thomas said. "They've already started calling you Ma when they think I'm not listening." Margaret felt her heart skip. "They have. Timothy started it, but Rebecca and Samuel have picked it up too. I think to them, you already are their mother in all the ways that matter." The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and wonderful. Margaret had never expected to be anyone's mother, and now she was being offered the chance to mother 3 children who desperately needed her. "One more condition," she said. "I want to know about Catherine, about your marriage with her, about what she meant to this family. I won't try to replace her or pretend she never existed, but I need to understand what I'm stepping into." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's fair. It might not be easy to talk about, but you have a right to know." Margaret took a deep breath, feeling as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump into an unknown future. "All right," she said quietly. "Yes, yes, yes, I'll marry you." The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his calloused ones. "Thank you," he said simply. "You won't regret this, Margaret? I promise you that." "I hope not," she replied, though she was surprised to realize she wasn't filled with doubt. Instead, she felt a sense of rightness, as if all the painful experiences that had brought her to this moment had been leading toward this choice. They were married 3 days later, in the small church in Cedar Falls, with half the town in attendance and the other half wishing they could be. Word had spread quickly about the unusual romance between the widowed rancher and the Eastern woman who had come west under such mysterious circumstances. Margaret wore her blue dress, the best she owned, with a simple wreath of autumn flowers that Rebecca had woven for her. Thomas wore his Sunday suit, freshly pressed and with a new white shirt that he had bought specially for the occasion. The ceremony was brief and practical, much like their courtship. But when Thomas kissed her at the altar, a gentle, respectful kiss that sealed their partnership rather than proclaimed their passion, Margaret felt something settle into place in her chest. She was no longer a bought woman working off a debt. She was Mrs. Thomas Mitchell, wife, mother, and partner, in building a life that was richer and more fulfilling than anything she had dared to dream. When Westbrook and his associates returned the following week, they found a properly married couple raising their children in a stable home. The investigator's disapproval was evident, but he had no grounds for criticism or interference. "Everything appears to be in order," he admitted reluctantly. "We'll file our report recommending that no further action be necessary." After the investigators left, Margaret found herself shaking with relief. The threat that had hung over the family was finally resolved. "It's over," she said, sinking into a chair on the front porch. It's over, Thomas agreed, sitting beside her. Thanks to you. Thanks to us, Margaret corrected. This was a family effort. As months passed, Margaret and Thomas began to build something together that was uniquely theirs, not a copy of his first marriage or a fulfillment of her girlish dreams, but a mature partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and growing affection. The children thrived under their new stability. Rebecca blossomed with Margaret's attention and guidance. Timothy grew more confident with two parents to love and protect him, and Samuel began to relax the serious responsibility he had carried for too long. Slowly, carefully, Margaret and Thomas were also growing closer. It began with small gestures, Thomas bringing her wildflowers from the range, Margaret mending his clothes with special care, shared glances across the dinner table, conversations that lasted long into the evening. One night in spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Thomas took Margaret's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said softly. "What is it?" "I think I'm falling in love with you." Margaret felt her heart skip. "Thomas, I know it wasn't part of our agreement," he continued quickly. "I know we said this would be a practical arrangement, but somewhere along the way, it became something more, at least for me." Margaret looked at their joined hands, thinking about all the ways her life had changed since that terrible day at the auction block. She thought about the children who called her Ma, the house that had become truly her home, and the man beside her, who had given her everything she had never dared to hope for. "For me, too," she whispered. Thomas turned to face her fully. "Really? Really?" Margaret met his eyes, seeing wonder and joy, and something that looked very much like love. "I never expected to feel this way about anyone, but you and the children, you've become my whole world." This time when Thomas kissed her, it was not the polite seal of a business arrangement, but the passionate promise of two people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for. Margaret stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Thomas and Samuel work with a new colt, while Rebecca helped Timothy with his arithmetic at the outdoor table. The scene was peaceful, domestic, perfect in its imperfection. She placed a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the strong kick of the child who had arrived before winter. After 5 years of marriage, when both she and Thomas had accepted that their family was complete, nature had surprised them with this unexpected gift. "The doctors were wrong," Thomas had said when they first discovered her condition, his face glowing with wonder and joy. "They were wrong about you, just like everyone else who said you had no value." Margaret smiled at the memory. She had indeed been wrong about many things, about her worth, about her future, about the possibility of love and family and belonging. "Ma!" Timothy called out, now 11 and still her most enthusiastic helper. "Come see what I figured out." "Coming, sweetheart," she called back, moving carefully down the porch steps. As she walked toward her family, her husband, her children, her life, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been sold as defective goods, bought by a desperate man, married for convenience, and somehow found more happiness than she had ever dreamed possible. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the worst things. Sometimes what the world called worthless was actually priceless. And sometimes love really could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing season. Margaret Sullivan Mitchell was living proof that no one was ever truly lost, as long as they were willing to believe in second chances and the possibility of new beginnings.